We work, we live, we innovate, and create. At the center of it all is your brain health. The ability to solve problems, think analytically, share empathy, and thrive.
We're trying to make brain performance really the next fitness revolution.
Scientific discoveries show that your brain can adapt and grow regardless of your starting point. The Center for Brain Health can show you how to transform your mind to work stronger and faster.
We learned from a national poll that 95% of people want to do something about their brains. The problem is they don't know where or how to start. At the Center for Brain Health, we have easy-to-use, scientifically proven tools to provide people a proactive path to do just that, to help people everywhere improve their quality of life through brain health. What's exciting is that it's easy to start, and starting is urgent because we are in a brain health crisis.
So how do you boost your brain power? How can better brain health help you focus on what's most important?
Brain training is a part of the way that we would distinguish ourselves from others. Quite frankly, I think it's going to be commonplace in businesses in years to come.
We are seeing an epidemic of mental health concerns. Stress and overload lead to depression, anxiety, and burnout. Our brains hold the key to navigate these hurdles. It's never too soon to start.
I think the greatest national security threat is pre-K through 12. If we don't take care of educating our young men and women, then we have to ask ourselves, where are we going to be in 20 years?
Research shows training middle schoolers how to think, problem solve, and innovate significantly improves academic achievement. Even more importantly, it enhances confidence and well-being for them to thrive throughout their lives.
It really helps the kid and it builds their stamina. I genuinely credit my success in the classroom from this program.
The key to the future is stronger brain health for individuals and communities. Ready to transform the world with us? Be a part of the brain health revolution. It starts here.
Welcome everyone here in Dallas and here virtually to our final installment of our Brain Health Presents series for this year. And tonight we are blessed to be talking about peak performance with, when you talk about can you make brain health cool, these two guys are going to do it tonight along with Dr. Julie Fratantoni. Brain health is cool, and we talk about translating brain health and research into something real and practical. And you're going to hear a very, very good example of that tonight with respect to elite performance and athletic performance. So we're all going to learn something tonight. I want to thank our sponsors tonight. First, the San Antonio Spurs, thank you. Generous donation on their behalf. And also from our local media sponsor, KERA. So thanks to both of them. We are a not-for-profit, so we look for support, we ask for support, we don't apologize it, because guess what? We're trying to improve brain health for every man, woman, and child on the planet. So, small goal, but that's where we're headed. So, without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Julie Fratantoni. There you are over there. And she's going to introduce our guests. And Dr. Fratantoni is one of our leading neuroscientists and also is heading up our Brain Health Project, which is a transformational project where we're going to reach not just hundreds of thousands, but millions of people to learn about how we measure brain health in improvement and in performance. So I'll turn it over to Julie. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve. Welcome, everybody. I have the pleasure of introducing our incredible guests tonight. Dr. Wesley Clapp and Dr. Brian Miller are neuroscientists who have combined their passion for sports with their deep knowledge of the brain to create cutting-edge technology to optimize performance. So over the last 15 years, their company Neuroscouting has collected, analyzed, and cataloged comprehensive neural metrics from tens of thousands of professional athletes. They've also been awarded multiple NIH grants for their ongoing work. Brian and Wes are some of the most humble, down-to-earth, and brilliant people that I have ever met. And don't worry, you don't have to be an elite athlete to benefit from their work tonight and what they'll be sharing. There's going to be takeaways for everyone here. So please join me in giving them a warm welcome. And I will just say, how this is going to work is that they are going to present for a bit, then I'm going to come back up, we're going to have a bit of a discussion, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. So for those of you online, you can be entering those into the chat, and with that, I'll let you two take it away.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Hopefully this is getting picked up, but there we are. Thanks so much for your time, all of you guys being here in person as well as the people here joining virtually. It's an absolute honor to be here. We are humbled to be on this stage. There have been some incredible people that have sat up here and told all of us and taught all of us very, very knowledgeable, tangible things that we can all do to increase our health, our brain health, and our wellness. I also want to thank Sandy and Steve and Mark and Jen and the whole Center for Brain Health. This is an incredibly ambitious project, and we are so excited to be collaborators in this, injecting some of our technologies into the Brain Health Project, and we're excited about where the future holds. So. As Julie laid out, for the next 20 to 30 minutes, we just want to kind of give you guys a broad stroke background on us, but most importantly, discuss our journey as neuroscientists in elite athletics, elite performance, and what things we learned about the brain's role in these, and what are things that from that we can all take away in our lives, right? The mere mortals. And what can we take to maintain our brain health, and what can we do maybe even to optimize it?
Definitely, and just to echo Wes, I mean, it's such an honor to be here and to be part of this historic project and to have you all here tonight, and thanks for your attention. Before we start diving into our sort of history and path in professional sports, I wanted to give you a little sense of our origin story. So Wes and I met out in the Bay Area in the around 2006. I was finishing up my PhD in the lab of Dr. Mark Esposito, who's here with us tonight, who's been not only a key member of the Brain Health Project, but also a longtime collaborator and advisor of ours. And Wes was actually the first postdoc in Adam Ghazali's lab, who was launching his lab out in across the bay at UCSF. And this was an incredible time to be coming of age as cognitive neuroscientists. Functional brain imaging was really starting to move beyond the key brain mapping steps, actually understanding how large-scale networks in the brain were giving rise to higher level cognition. It was also starting to peel back a lot of individual differences in these brain networks, how they were communicating, and how these individual differences were really key for what individuals are able to do in the real world and real world behavior. So it was around this time too that our second major passion, aside from the brain, and our two passions really started colliding and converging as huge sports fans. And here in the lab, we were studying a lot of things about visual motor control and decision making. Meanwhile, we were watching elite athletes deploy these at a high level. And we were really connecting a lot of dots in our heads about what the field of neuroscience could really afford and bring to the elite athlete space. So upon meeting, actually, literally the day we met, and realized we'd been running on parallel tracks. We had a long conversation and decided that we wanted to start neuroscouting to really translate a lot of the fundamental research that was coming out of this exciting field and bring it into the real world of human performance and health. So we're going to dive in today a lot on our path, most specifically in Major League Baseball for a number of reasons. First, that's the area we've dove the deepest in and have the most history over the past 15 years, but it also serves as an incredible microcosm to discuss about some of the key areas that the brain contributes to real-world performance, but also where technology and technology solutions can really help to interface to both measure and improve brain function.
Great. I will start us here. So I think, I first want to acknowledge the fact that there may be diehard baseball fans in the crowd, and there may be people who don't follow baseball, don't follow sports at all, and really are just wanting to kind of learn about the brain's role and expertise. And I hope there's takeaways for all all levels here. But I think no matter what, when we look at an elite athlete performing on the biggest stage, I think all of us are blown away by the things that we can observe, right? The speed, the athleticism, all those tools that we can see from the stands. And that's a huge component of being an elite performer. But baseball is a fascinating one, right? Because it's a sport in which the physicality of an athlete can explain some of the story, but it can't explain all of it, right? So we look at two of the most talented athletes in baseball, Aaron Judge and Jose Altuve, and you can see their physical statures are completely different, right? So there is definitely something else and more that meets the eye there. And I think as an industry, you know, even as fans, all of us, we look at these athletes and we say, how do they do it, right? And that question of how is more of a question of awe from a fan's perspective. But for a sports organization, that understanding of the how is actually incredibly important because it informs the way that they develop young talent and also the way that they acquire the next wave of talent through the draft, through scouting. And so really truly understanding that how it works is key. Now the scouting industry years and years ago was very reliant on how the player looked, but it doesn't tell us everything, right? And there was a very famous kind of Moneyball era 25 years ago where the Oakland A's, amongst a few other small teams, were realizing that they needed to be looking at statistical performance about how players got on base. How were they actually producing out on the field rather than just the way they look? There's a famous line from the book from Michael Lewis, as they were discussing a player, they were saying, wait a second, we're not trying to sell genes here, right? They were realizing teams were overvaluing the way they looked and not all these other metrics. And so for us as neuroscientists, as we stepped in 15 years ago, we felt like if we could provide a neuroscientific lens into this sport, giving and educating and understanding the way that the brain plays a role in this sport, we could not only help the athletes themselves in terms of their development, but also help organizations in regards to scouting and player development of their talent. Sorry.
Okay, to start diving in on the brain in baseball, let's get right to the real heart of the sport, which is the battle between the pitcher and the hitter. We call this the battle zone. I want to talk about two developments over our time in baseball over the past 10 years that has really shifted the balance of power away from the hitter to the pitcher. And the first of these is over on the left side. What you see here is an unprecedented uptick in the velocity of pitches. You don't really need to worry about that graph too much, except to see both of those lines are going up. What that's showing is that the velocity of pitching across the board for both starters and relievers is increasing. The second phenomenon I wanted to talk about is that the design of pitches to make them more deceptive through a phenomenon called tunneling. So I'll show you a video of what tunneling is. But what I want you to really look at is these two pitches are going to come out of the pitcher's hand at the exact same release point, but they're going to end up in wildly different parts of the zone. One is a fastball for a strike, one is an off-speed pitch down in the dirt. And what I really want you to look at, and I'll start this video in a second, is the path these pitches take for the first part of that battle zone. So there's a fastball. It's off-speed in the dirt. And it's going to slow it down here. And then it'll pause it. What you see here is the first part of that trajectory is identical. So this phenomenon of tunneling is that the trajectory is following the exact same tunnel. So from the hitter's perspective, what this is doing is making it so much later in the course of the pitch that they get the information they need to decipher and figure out what's coming their way. So obviously, everything that the pitcher is trying to do is to really almost that double whammy. It's tightening the decision window they have with increasing the velocity, but also trying to be more deceptive to make it a more challenging decision. So this is really pushing every aspect of what cognitive neuroscientists think of as all the brain regions and networks involved in the perception action cycle. So I'm not going to talk about all the functional MRI and other research that has gone into delineating all these different pathways, except to say that it starts with a lot of basic visual processing that leads to a lot of decisions about higher level patterns that actually guides decisions about how to act in the world and then executes the behavior. So we're going to see this in the context of a at-bat here. So obviously, every part of this chain is called upon in real-world baseball. Obviously, the ability to bring a plan in, be able to sort of get some early visual information about the release point, the spin, the rotation, the trajectory, and the location of the ball, convert that into a recognition of the pitch type, actually use that to guide a decision and to make the swing. So entering the sport, obviously, this is incredibly difficult at the neural level, right? Breaking it down, and I intentionally didn't go into all the details because we could be here all night. But basically, failure at any part of this critical set of interacting brain regions could lead to failure on the field. So as neuroscientists, we were really interested in how could we potentially use neuroscience-based innovation and technology to actually measure these different brain systems in each athlete. And obviously, as I talked about our backgrounds in the field, using a lot of functional MRI, you can't run every potential prospect through a functional MRI scan. So our job in trying to translate this out of the lab was to actually figure out how we could package this into technology. And this was also an exciting time back in that window where a lot of research was coming out about the power of video games. Researchers have been using almost like very simple video games for a long time to interface with the brain. And this offered a very key vehicle to be able to interface with brain systems, turn dials that software can allow to be able to push demand levels. And what ends up resulting is a very reliable readout of how a lot of these different brain systems are working. So we took a number of these key different building blocks of tasks that have been used in the literature and actually injected them into baseball environments so that we were layering them on top of baseball simulation demands that are relatable and contextualized to the player, but getting a very powerful readout on all the brain systems that were involved. So armed with this prototype and set of technologies, we approached one of the most forward-thinking and progressive MLB organizations back in 2008 and set up an unprecedented partnership with them where we would bring this technology and the ability to measure what's under the hood in these hitters. And they would open up their entire system of players, all the hitters. So we're focusing on the hitting side here and being able to manage that difficult side of the battle zone. And so they opened up the entire system from the lowest levels of rookie ball all the way up to the MLB superstars. And we set out on a collaboration to figure out not just which of the brain systems that we could measure were most important for what these elite athletes were able to do on the field, but also how we could refine our technology so that they could package that and deliver it in the real world. So after that gathering of data and collaboration, we packaged a set of technologies that they were able to use, canvassing the entire country leading up to the draft, to finally be able to get under the hood about how a young player's brain in Alaska that might not be seeing the top-notch competition compares to a high school kid here in Texas with tough competition, being able to put them on the same plane and look at them in terms of what their vision motor capabilities are, and which gave a big sense on maybe what their potential could look like in terms of being able to handle the intense visual motor demands that are above what they're likely to see in amateur ball. So this was a really exciting contribution to sort of the next step in the post-Moneyball era. But from what's my perspective as well, being able to sort of measure these brain systems obviously is a really key ingredient for being able to improve them. So we wanted to push on that avenue as well.
Yeah, so that kind of leads to kind of the next question, which is how does an elite brain become elite, right? How do these players learn this skill and continue to refine even at the top level of competition? And the core answer here is, of course, the term that many of you guys know of neuroplasticity, right? The brain is a fascinating organ in that it is the machine that drives all of our behavior. But what's also interesting is that behavior and the environment feed back onto the brain and change its structure and its function. So this is really the core of how we attain skill and how we get better. There have been some fascinating neuroimaging studies really looking at expertise. And in regards to visual motor expertise, they've taken expert jugglers and brought in normal people who don't know how to juggle, and they see changes in brain structure, gray matter in the associative visual cortices for people who are very, very skilled, seasoned jugglers. Now, if they take a group of people who don't know how to juggle and take half of them and start training them, and the other half not, they actually will see, even after 6 weeks of training, you'll see gray and white matter changes in the brain. So this has been replicated in perceptual learning. This has been replicated in pitch detection for expert musicians. Likewise, there's a famous set of studies, many of you may have read about them or heard about them, out of University of College London about 25 years ago, but looking at taxi drivers in London, where previous to GPS, they were really over years of experience downloading almost the entire map of London. And what they saw was that in these seasoned taxi drivers, in comparison to normal people, they had larger posterior hippocampi, the area that's very specific in this kind of spatial navigation, memory. And they saw that the size of that correlated with the years of experience that the drivers had on the road. So all of these are just beautiful examples of the way that our brain changes. Our brain is a success-driven machine, and when it's faced with challenge, it will adapt itself in order to try to succeed in the face of that challenge. And that is what these athletes are leveraging as they begin their skill acquisition and refinement. And there's ways to generate and use technology to accelerate that as well.
Definitely. So bringing this back onto the field, when a lot of fans think about some of the greatest hitters of the past generation, the Ken Griffey Jr.'s, the Barry Bonds, the Cal Ripkens, they often gravitate towards the family bloodlines of these players, left to assume that the secret to their success was largely due to their genetics. From our perspective as neuroscientists, what's fascinating is the extremely unique mileage they had being born into these baseball families, where with a bat in their hand from their earliest days, being at the ballpark, growing up around older players and learning from their dads and all this incredible talent. They had such a unique path of mileage for laying down all these different visual-motor skills. And that, from our angle, is the most exciting avenue of developing a sport that, like most read and react sports, is so dependent on this development of these visual motor systems. So baseball is all about mileage, and I think that brings up a very fundamental problem for mileage, which is just like, how do you push the brain when the brain can only learn at game speed and can only sort of like really be pushed to change at that level? This is not feasible, obviously, in the real world in terms of how these skills can develop. So, obviously a hitter cannot just keep on swinging because that takes a huge physical toll on his body. A pitcher can't waste his bullets and his arm in practice. So diving in deep in this realm, partnering in MLB, the key question was, how can we use technology to help get meaningful mileage away from the field, to actually interface with the brain meaningfully, that can help in develop these visual motor systems and help with the acceleration away from the field. So technology can actually help in a number of different ways. One is that it affords, especially with a lot of advancements in video game programming and new engines that are emerging, along with new immersive capabilities, it affords a lot of capabilities to mirror the training environment to match as close as possible to what they're seeing on the field. Unlike game time and in practice experience in the actual real world, software can be dialed up and down to meet the individual, as I said on the analysis side as well, but to meet the individual's brain right above where it's at. We call this almost like the zone of maximal neuroplasticity, to actually be super individualized and guide the brain along with demands that are perfectly meeting their weakness point. It can also be highly tethered to the real world in terms of actually being driven by coaches, driven by real world data, to make sure that the composition of this technology training is giving them the most important mileage for their strength and weakness areas. So what we came up with is a set of integrated software-based mileage, almost, if you will, systems that players could use and train away from the stadium and push these brain circuits in an individualized manner, and do that in a way that the software platform could evolve with them up to the big league level and obviously get more nuanced and advanced with their skill level. So this was a great contribution to solve that problem of not being able to sort of push the brain consistently at game speed. And what did we learn from this? So obviously, on our end, we would not being able to, which we hope to run at some point, is a full longitudinal fMRI study looking at the changes in these athletes' brains. But what we would do is drop occasional diagnostic benchmarks that would evaluate their brains along the way using game mechanics that were different than the ones they were training on. So we would test these brain circuits and get a sense of their maturation. And from that, we would see almost like 3 cohorts of players. We'd see the players that were really improving significantly as measured by those benchmarks. We'd see the ones that were pushing the system and improving slightly, but not to that same degree. And then we'd see some that were not effortfully engaging in a way that was driving change. And when you took these three cohorts and looked at their jumps on the field from season to season, what we saw is that was linked with the biggest jumps on the field. So I mentioned these group sort of snapshots because one of the big things, obviously, dealing with the brain only being one piece of this very complicated puzzle, this wasn't a one-to-one mapping, right? So obviously, we'll talk about a lot of other factors that come into helping the neural skill and that component of the skill manifest on the field. But there's both physical and in terms of others, things that can impact that. So what we're really doing is trying to use technology to position their brain to drive the rest of these factors, their physical tools, as optimally as possible to give them the best chance in that battle zone against the pitcher. So we developed that technology, and I'll hand it on to Wes here.
Yeah, so in the kind of grand scheme of our journey, that first 10 years was really us focusing in on developing technology to really interface with the brain to assess how well it was working and then be able to provide technology to train it. And through that, we got to know the athletes incredibly well, and we got to see them performing night after night on the world's biggest stages. And I think it opened our eyes to yet another skill set that these athletes have, which is the fact that they can deploy these systems and at an elite level against incredible competition in front of tens of thousands of people and millions of more people watching online. And you think about the fact that, what that does to the body and the brain, right? I think in some ways societally, we tend to put athletes on a bit of a pedestal. We might idolize them. We say, oh my gosh, they get to play a game as a job, like how lucky. But I think that's totally, not taking into consideration the fact that every single thing that they do is under a microscope. Their life outside of professional athletics is judged by everybody, but likewise, anything that they do on the field is going to be remembered in infamy, right? So your successes will live on with you forever, but also your failures. There are social media channels that are dedicated to watching elite athletes fail. And so for us, it was very much an eye-opening experience to say, wow, this is a true skill set that's outside of what we had just been studying, but is so related to the brain, as you'll see here in a second. And this is a skill that technology can, again, potentially assess, but also maybe help them in this struggle to be able to perform on the world's biggest stage in the face of all of this pressure.
Definitely, and we'll tell you a little anecdote about our path of discovery on this. So as I said, over a multi-year process, we get to know these players' brains extremely well. We get to know the players that are really excelling in these visual-motor abilities. And what we'd see over the years is a lot of question marks. Sometimes players would do well and they were improving, as I mentioned, but it wasn't translating onto the field. And we always sort of wonder why. We would talk to staff. But one of the really exciting avenues that we developed about 10 years ago is every spring we started running almost like an esports tournament in spring training. So teams would get all bracketed up, they'd go head to head, they'd get super into it, hyper competitive, and big prizes on the line. So basically for the first time ever, we had a sense of, obviously now we'd gotten to know these players so well, training in isolation on their personal devices. But now, how did this manifest when they were in this tournament high leverage situation? What was happening as they were in this tight battle for their team? And what we saw was a lot of interesting patterns. Some of the best players that were elite in a lot of our metrics and were training consistently, we'd see them keep an even keel and stay there. What you think about on the field is maybe a clutch performer who doesn't let the situation rise up and get too big. But then we'd also see a whole cohort of players that in this performance context, we'd see a dip. And we were very fascinated by that. And obviously, as that gets at with Wes, what's going on in these players' brains that are not allowing them to manifest these abilities on the field. So to bring this into the normal context, I want to just raise the framework of the on-deck circle, right? This is sort of the moment before players are going out to compete and perform at the highest levels. Alone, preparations in the rear view mirror, alone with their thoughts and their mindset stepping into their performance zone. We all have our on-deck circles, right? It's the calm before a big board meeting. It's the drive to a big speech at church or work or school, whatever it may be. Those moments where we're trying to get our body into a spot to succeed and show our skills and demand. So a few high-level things about how athletes handle stress. So the most important thing is that despite stress and all the negative things we hear about it, stress isn't inherently supposed to be bad. It's actually supposed to be a dial that turns up your body and neurochemically sets the environment to mobilize and perform. So it actually facilitates to sharpen and hone cognition. So where stress becomes very problematic for performers is when that dial of physiological arousal gets to a tipping point, and you see that end up leading to a steep degradation in performance. And what's happening in the brain at that is that this sort of rallying cry, this mobilizing to be able to execute the task at hand, ends up being almost a 5-alarm fire, and precious resources that would be neurally dedicated to computing the task at hand are shifted to be able to handle your physiological response. And so, in terms of this, there's a huge amount of individual variability across athletes in the shapes of these curves and how folks are able to manage stress inputs, particularly around when your physiology is revving up. What are the regulatory capacity skills to be able to dial that back down into your sweet spot, to be able to harness your physiological ramp up, not to go off the cliff, but to be able to bring it into your spot to perform. So there's a lot of individual variability in that. And to add one other layer of complexity, it also depends upon the state we're in as we're facing stress, right? So you talk about a lot of high performance states. You may have heard things about being in a high heart rate variability state. Some of these other states that help you better manage this. So in terms of all these different components, as we were diving in deep, and often we would talk to players and they would relay to us that, like, I feel like I can do really well at your skills and in the training, but like once I get up there in the box, I can just feel my body revving up. And so we were thinking very much in terms of feedback from players, but also with our organizations in terms of how can we use technology to help grow this dimension of skill, which is a huge component of being able to do what they do. And so we built out our own wearable device to be able to track physiological states in these players. And rather than using it for tracking and getting a sense if you might wear a fitness tracker, we were much more interested in actually using this to power in real time closed loop software systems with our hardware that could be used to help players learn a lot about how to understand their physiology and how, as I said, to regulate it and harness it. And so we've devised a whole set of tools based upon collaborative input from organizations and players to do a number of different things. One is helping players win the on-deck circle. What are some things that each individual can do, whether it be breath work, whether it be certain things they're working with a performance psychologist on self-talk, whatever it may be, to be able to get their body into a spot where their physiological state is in their optimal state. We've also developed a lot of tools that, since we can use the software in real time to provide challenges and stressors to the individual to actually push them to failure, how can they learn about how they respond to failure, but then also see that and then try to dial it back down and learn how to almost what a lot of athletes call clear the mechanism, which is what happens when a pitcher gives up a home run. Okay, how do you get ready for the next pitch like that didn't happen? And a lot of that is this physiological control. So this was an exciting avenue because we knew how fundamental this ability to control and regulate your autonomic nervous system was to allow the highest levels of your visual motor ability to play and to manifest on the field. And it's been a fun collaboration for a number of reasons, but a primary one because it also has an enormous set of implications outside of baseball for the rest of us in our on-deck circles as well.
Great. So we definitely want to get to questions, of course, but let's talk about a few of the things that we've learned that all of us can maybe apply to our everyday lives. I think one of the main things that we have learned is, and most important, is there's hope, right? I mean, we're talking about the elite of elite in terms of skill acquisition, and these athletes dive in and day out and continue to refine and improve. And so I think for wherever you are on the spectrum of whatever you're trying to improve at, knowing that there is improvement, there's room for improvement as we dedicate ourselves to that is incredibly important. And in that journey of improvement, it's important to take kind of an athlete's mindset. And what do I mean by that? I think the first thing is kind of reframing our thought of challenge. I think in many ways, people see challenge as, oh my gosh, I might fail, it's hard. Whereas we see the athletes just dive into challenge. They know that that's where growth lies, and they strive for it, knowing that that's how they're going to improve in what they do. The second part is that the growth, the improvement is nonlinear. Just realizing that the plateaus that you're going to hit in your striving to improvement, potential valleys as your brain reorganizes itself, and then those peaks, right, as you start to really accelerate learning and skill acquisition. And the third thing on the athlete's mindset side is finding the metrics that matter. Really interesting, sometimes we would see two players come off the field after the end of a game, both of them went 0 for 4, didn't get a hit, and one of them's dejected, and the other one is going, okay, well, in the second at bat, there was 2 pitches that, 6 months ago I would have chased always, and I didn't chase those 2 pitches. They were nasty, but I didn't chase them. And in the third at bat, I hit a beautiful line drive. The guy made an amazing play, but I can't control that, right? So knowing that you got to point your arrows towards the things that matter the most and the things that you can improve, that you can control. And if you really focus on those things, the grander results will follow.
Definitely, and a couple follow-ons from there. So obviously, one of the other things that we can all take away is, as I was saying, is win our on-deck circle, right? And recognize that all the things we care about in health and performance, a lot of that happens behind the scenes and then setting the stage. So obviously, athletes push on a lot of the same systems we all need to in terms of sleep, correct fueling with nutrition, all of these things that help set the stage, and then also being very aware and learning more about how your body's responding to the pressures you're feeling, because that's a key avenue for any domain of performance and is absolutely integral to brain health. One final thing which sports also really relate to us is make sure you're doing what you love, right? Because obviously an engaged brain is a learning brain and is a healthy brain. And I think for a lot of these athletes, that love of the game is so profound and being able to help them continue to push. And I think a lot of them as well, it can carry over into them really growing to drive reward from the journey and the strive as well, in terms of being able to actually grow to love the process of preparation, which I think can help us all in terms of pushing forward and hopefully really reaching our goals in every area of brain health. So we're really excited excited for the conversation, and really thanks for the attention, and we wanted to go from there. Thank you.
Am I on? Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Wow, thank you. I know I have a lot of questions, so I'm excited to get to chat with you guys. So, here at the center, we talk a lot about brain health, and there's many different aspects of brain health, and really how this is a term that a lot of people don't know or aren't familiar with. And so I'm curious, from your perspective, how has this concept of, I think most people think about sports, they think about the physical aspects, and so you're really bringing this perspective, and so how has that changed, during your time in the industry?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I definitely feel like the evolution of that discussion has grown so much in the last 15 years. I think one of the pieces here is the concussion crisis, right? All of a sudden people, while it seems obvious now when we think about it, but all of a sudden people were really realizing the role that the brain plays in elite athletics or elite performance, and that when it is damaged in any way, shape, or form, you can't perform at that high level. And that kind of just turned the light bulb on. Oh my goodness, the brain is playing an incredibly important role, and there have been amazing leaders in that space kind of educating there.
Definitely, and I think, a big thing about taking technology into the real world in sports, even when we came in, everyone sort of knew the brain was involved to some degree, but it was sort of like very much a black box, and I think like part of that education process sort of raised a lot of developing athletes of this new generation are understanding this component, understanding the capability to improve these. And I think, like, especially with a lot of the new systems that are coming out to help improve brain health, I think there's a lot more receptivity amongst athletes and also even coaches, you know, in terms of being able to sort of figure out, like, I know that my brain health is so fundamental to my performance. And I think there's just been a lot of education and a lot of new awareness of this that's been really helpful over the past 15 years.
So I forgot to remind everyone, for those of you virtual, go ahead and be putting questions into the chat as you think of them. And for anyone in the live audience, there's notepads so you can also jot down your questions, because we will have time for that at the end. Okay, so in working with these athletes, how do they feel about engaging with technology like this? I could imagine that could be intimidating.
Definitely, yeah. I mean, it sort of goes from my conversation as well. You know, definitely, you know, as we entered, it was, you know, baseball has a lot of traditional ways of developing talent, and I think for us there was a lot of early education, because I think, you know, obviously with technology it can come and be a little bit frightening both for the player and coaches. It's just like, especially on the coaching end, is this something that, like, is trying to do something I can't do? And that's really not the case at all. I mean, there's basically a lot of education around, like, how can technology actually help you and complement what you're doing to actually give you new tools to help hitters develop as well. And I think there was huge education and really sort of, you know, us sort of getting deep. And this is one of the reasons why, in addition to, as I said, learning a lot about each player to be able to give them the most impactful technology-driven training intervention, was to get really deep with coaches, to get into that education process. We learned more from them than they learned from us, and, like, we were definitely injecting a lot of that into our technology development, because, as I said, we want this to mirror what they're trying to do with these players, and so I think there was a lot of really good collaboration that ended up you know, adding a lot more comfort for coaches and obviously for players. You know, it was also a really good time where technology was becoming a lot more, I mean, from our generation growing up without cell phones, it's a very different, you know, athlete population these days. And so the amenable to technology, and also technology as a way to help them, has only increased during that time as well.
I think the other thing was, you know, in speaking of our learning journey, you know, coming as basic neuroscientists and trying to translate some of that into actionable technology, we realized very quickly how difficult of a problem that is, right? If you can have the perfect lab experiment, but if you then take that out of the lab and ask people to interact with technology that's doing solely that, it's difficult, right? You have to really listen and pay attention, especially when you're talking about training technologies, where you're asking somebody to interact with technology day after day to push these systems to get better. Is you have to realize they're humans, right? These are people that are just like all of us, and you need to understand the way that their world works. And this is in terms of the contextually relevant side of things, but also the cadence of the way that their day is and the way that you can fit into all the demands that they have on them, so that they're going to reap the most benefits because they're engaged, you're driving it with great science, but you have to, like, have that reciprocity.
Yes. So you talked about athletes living life under a microscope, and you know, I think we maybe can't relate to being on national television, but we can all relate to having stress in our lives. And so what are some of the ways that you're helping brain train these athletes to manage that stress and their autonomic nervous system?
Definitely, that's a great question. And I think, you know, as I mentioned, this wearable, obviously, and the integration with the software, we view as sort of a foundational set of tools that we can build on top of with expertise. But I mentioned heart rate variability, you know, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, and obviously is integral to brain health as well. But it's your body's ability to, you know, everyone thinks of the heart as a metronome, for those who aren't familiar with this, but actually the more variability in between each heartbeat is actually a sign of real autonomic flexibility and regulatory capacity. Your ability to almost dial up and down the demands as needed to accurately meet the real world and the real world stressors with the physiological response that are required. So using something like HRV can help us in a number of different ways, because obviously it's a state that is more of a global state in terms of being able to have higher HRV over time, but it's also something we can help players sort of achieve through different things that are complementing what performance psychologists and experts in developing the psychological components of the sport can recommend in terms of, as I was alluding to a little bit, for each player the buttons are different, but maybe it's individualized breath work or short breathing protocols for one player. It could be sort of self-talk or visualization for another. These sort of things that can help them learn and see what's going to get them into a optimal state, and that may be with HRV there.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two ways here, right? So one is just objectively allowing them to see when they try these different tools, what actually moves their physiology, so that they can subjectively say, okay, if I do this thing, I think I feel better, but they can actually see what's happening in real time physiologically. And then secondarily, allowing that closed loop system to power an experience where they can be presented with even something as extreme of watching themselves fail, making errors out on the field, and seeing what happens to their physiological response. And likewise, being able to, if they can harness it and control it, they can actually flip the script and actually see other types of videos, maybe highlights of themselves. So really kind of marrying the personalized content on their side and powering it with physiology so that they can train themselves so that when they step out into the on-deck circle, they have a tool belt full of tools that they can say, all right, I know it may not be perfect, the situation is huge, it's the World Series, whatever it may be, but I'm in a much better position than if I had none of that at my disposal.
So just to make an analogy, typically we think about having a lower resting heart rate is associated with better physical health, and kind of the opposite is having a higher increased heart rate variability is actually associated with this better autonomic function or this adaptability in the face of challenge. Brian, you said something I think earlier today just about one of the best things that you can do for yourself is to sort of train this, is to live a life that is full of challenges. And so explain a little bit more about what you mean by that.
Definitely. Yeah, I mean, I think there's no way to build this resilience other than mileage in real life, right? I mean, being in situations that are pushing you beyond your capabilities and throwing yourself into those situations and feeling that hum of your body, but then feeling yourself harness that and be able to execute and do that. And that sort of mileage is just so invaluable in terms of developing these skills in the real world. And I think that's why we view, technology as sort of a complement, but by no means a replacement for actually being able to sort of push these abilities in the real world too. And I think that's why we view, obviously for a seasoned veteran in baseball that's seen everything, he's been on the biggest stages, every sort of story of like him facing those challenges throughout his life has led him to have the resilience he has stepping into a new situation. But for young players, ones that are thrown into high pressure, I've never seen this in high school. I've never been on TV in front of this many people. Helping them sort of have some tools and also awareness that these systems are also trainable and are plastic, just like your other abilities. And it's a whole other dimension they can work on. So we're not by no means using technology to replace sort of, like you said, the important part of the real world sort of development of these skills, but as a complement to help move them along.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we are ready to take some questions from the audience. And I see one back there, and Bonnie's actually going to be bringing the microphone to you. So.
I didn't know I'd get a mic, but I'm a huge baseball fan, and so I can't thank you enough. This is one of the best programs I've been to here, and I've been here involved with Sandy for 20 years. Several questions. You guys took the batter side of the equation. This is kind of colloquial. This is real technical. Were you able to find out from these batters when in a pitch they had to make a decision when to swing? If they knew a fastball was coming, obviously they had to swing a little bit sooner. Was it like halfway off the mound?
It's
Yeah, wait a second now, I've got to.
Okay.
So you were able to, in a way, coach these guys and see their development, what they were learning. So you watched a lot of ball games. So you watch these guys in real-time ball games. So you could actually see these guys that were in that top one-third, improving, and you could see them come to bat and actually perform incredibly well from what you had, quote, coach said, or what they had learned from what you were doing. And the last question is genetics versus brain balance, or versus brain function. And you had to hear the name Ted Williams, okay? And I'm sure you heard it a lot, because the man had incredible vision, as you know. He could see the threads on the ball coming at him, and he could determine what pitch he was going to swing at by seeing the threads on that ball. Did you find any players that were like that? That told you that they could actually see the threads on the ball, and they could determine what kind of pitch was coming at them? Those are my 3 questions.
Okay, so we'll get to, I'll try to piece these together and let us know if we're answering all the, so I think the first one, so, obviously hearing players talk about what they're doing up at the plate and describing how far, and we've had a lot of fascinating conversations. I mean, one of the interesting parts about expertise is it's sort of laying down these complex associations, but almost making them automatic to almost where they're cognitively impenetrable. Like you don't, almost like if someone's asking you how do you ride a bike or things like that, it's like very hard for them to describe necessarily the intuitions and feelings that they have as they're seeing a pitch released. I mean, you definitely hear a lot of stories about certain pitch types, for example. Sliders are famous for having a spin that generates a red dot. This gets a little bit at your third one, but it's the easiest one to sort of see this red dot. And, oftentimes sliders are some of the hardest pitches to get on. So a lot of hitters will just make a decision. If I see a red dot, I'm going to hold off, whatever it may be. And so they can describe some of these patterns, but a lot of it is very nuanced sort of feelings that they've laid down from these associations. And oftentimes it's a little bit hard for them to describe exactly what they're seeing. And that would probably be a quick first.
I think, and kind of connecting it to the third one as well, they use a lot of different visual inputs, right? So one of the other things that they really look at is shape of pitch, right? So they're trying you talk to players about like looking for pop, and that's to see if they see any type of off-speed pitch, they're gonna see it rise out of the pitcher's hand. And it's all about the brain's ability to kind of set these templates and say, if I see something that looks like this, I'm going. If I see something like this, I have more time. So maybe I'm going, maybe I'm not. Or like the red dot example, if I see this, I'm gonna try to lay off. And so it's about this kind of expertise in pattern recognition, and most importantly, how it's linking in with the decision making and the firing of the system to then deploy this complex biomechanical swing to say, yeah, I'm going.
So they're looking at the release out of the hand.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question from the audience here.
Well, that's a great talk. So the question I have is about the differences among the elite players and the, let's say, more average players. I'm curious if you have collected any data pertaining to the differences in the experience of failure, failed attempts. And unfortunately, my knowledge about baseball is not so deep, but I'll use an example of an elite from another sport, like Michael Jordan for basketball, right? And he talked about how what made him so effective in his career is that he took more shots than other players. He said, I've amassed so many points throughout my career, but I've also missed more shots than my counterparts. And it made me wonder, from a neuroscientific perspective, is the phenomenology of failure different for the elites compared to the average players? Is it that the experience of failure is encoded differently in the brains of the elites, or is it exactly the same? It's just the ability to reset, as you talked about earlier. Is there a combination? I'm curious if you have any data on this or any speculation.
I mean, I'll take a first swing, if you will. So first off, baseball is a fascinating sport because it is, I mean, as a position player, as a hitter, you're failing 2/3 of the time. If you're failing 2/3 of the time, you're like in the Hall of Fame, right? So they fail all the, right? A 300 hitter is just like, their tastes of success are so small. But that's more on the objective metric of like getting hits, right? But this is kind of what we were talking about, like finding the metrics of progress that you can, right? Like not chasing bad pitches is huge. That's a win, right? But I think in the realm of your question, I do think that there, again, when we're talking about experience-driven plasticity, because our brains are these success-driven machines, when we fail, our brains are going to try to reweigh themselves in order to say, when I see that situation again, I'm gonna try, I've now learned from that. And I think there are definitely differences in terms of how quickly people can reweigh and, kind of become successful in the actual outcome metric, right? So everyone's kind of reweighing, but some people are reweighing more correctly, more quickly to where the intended goal is. But it's a great question.
Yeah, I think just anecdotally, it brings up something fascinating we've learned from scouts that have deployed our technology with young hitters. There's almost two different flavors of, because our modules are, as we alluded, are designed to be incredibly difficult. They're designed to push these brain circuits beyond what players can handle. So it forces them to failure, right? And we hear a lot of anecdotes about the different ways the players respond to that, and what, from a scout's perspective, that tells them about how they handle failure and what that might mean, and how they push themselves in real world training as well. Because you see the players that are failing and they're digging back in. They're sort of like, it's revving them up, almost like an opportunity to like, I want to use this as a way to sort of conquer this. I don't want, and then you see some that sort of like push back and are just like, start blaming, I'm not, this is just a video game, it's not the real, or some other ways where they're obviously like, they're not appraising the failure as an opportunity to really grow. It's almost like a threat to some degree. So I think there's definitely a lot of orientation, and obviously, given how important, as Wes said, failure is to learning, your sort of approach around it as being that sort of opportunity versus something that's coming after you, I think is a big sort of like, sort of different path that could have a big determinant on the training trajectory.
Yeah, and I'll get over there. Since failure is a learning opportunity, I did learn a lot because I failed to repeat the question from the virtual audience, so sorry about that. But I'll bring the microphone to Todd. But real quick, from the virtual audience, while I bring the microphone to Todd, did you see any component where age made a difference in these athletes? Because we look at age-related differences in response. What did you find neurologically from that in your research?
Definitely, definitely. Age is a huge component because age is obviously correlated with mileage, right, which is what we were talking about. And we do see, especially with a lot of these decision-making circuits, they're maturing well into the late 20s, and obviously that can vary based upon the individual. But that's during a lot of the prime time of Major League Baseball hitters and athletes' careers. So their brains are continuing to change. But if you do look at age-related cohorts, you do see, obviously, if you look at college players versus high school, you will generally see that, once again, as a group, the collegiate hitters will be more advanced in these visual motor systems, as you would expect them to, having more years of mileage, seeing top-notch competition versus high school and maybe a little more raw and less mileage. So age is a huge component, and it's also a huge component about how hitters develop well into their pre-retirement years, because you sort of see these players that, baseball has a natural sort of learning curve where actually your body starts breaking down, and it actually starts pushing your brain in a little bit different ways than your brain's been pushed the rest of your career. Because if you had an amazing quick bat speed, lightning quick bat speed your entire career, you might not have had to build out a lot of the early recognition, a lot of the early brain systems that hitters use to detect right out of the hand, as we were saying, the pitch. So once their machinery on the physical side starts declining, there's sort of two paths. One is that they sort of fall off a cliff because they haven't pushed that. Or you see these players that are able to continue to hone that, and also at that point start leveraging their expertise, right? So now they've got all this knowledge about what certain pitchers are like, how the pitcher's most likely to handle them. They've got all this almost crystallized knowledge about the game that they can almost start compensating for a little bit of decline in maybe their pure visual motor abilities or speed, and also for physical, and you see them have amazing careers. So age is a huge component. Its relation to the physical component and decline there, and that's a number of the trends we've seen over the years.
Todd?
Two quick questions.
Keep talking.
Number one, awesome job. Really great presentation. Brian, early on you mentioned your ability and opportunity to work with a very progressive major league club. Was that club in Arlington, Texas, my friend?
No comment on that.
So
No disclosure there, we don't get to guess. But obviously your academic career, you guys have been at it and really making huge strides academically in the research arena. Can you talk a little bit about your journey on the commercialization so that the average, high school collegiate athlete can take advantage of maybe what you're doing in your training? How does that work?
Yeah. So I think just that journey has been a learning one for us for sure, because as I was saying, kind of trying to take tasks out of our academic backgrounds and actually bringing them into action has been an incredible learning journey. At this point, a lot of our technology is heavily deployed at the big league level and in major leagues and through the minor league system. But the idea here is, and especially in terms of some of this autonomic control and regulatory capacity stuff, is that the applicability outside of elite athletics is huge, right? And in many ways for us it was an amazing sandbox to really learn, can we create technology that can assess and parse apart differences at the elite level and actually measure differences amongst that population and then train it and show that we can impact on-field performance. And I think that's kind of our mindset in anything that we're doing, is trying to learn from that journey and starting to apply technology elsewhere to try to help all the rest of us, of course.
So we have Dr. Chapman. We're running out of microphones. We'll have time for 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up.
So excited about this. I would like you to translate it outside of sports. And wouldn't it be fun if we had it out there where people could say, how stressed do I feel right now, and see what it does, because this is part of our brain health project. But when you think about people, not sports, and I'm saying this for you, Judge Luther, that are involved in very stress-related lives, maybe get involved in the justice system, how could something like this, or people that are living in poverty and stress constantly, what can this do to help them in the day-to-day performance? What do you see the application to help people flourish that aren't at the elite level, but if they flourish a little, it can make a big difference?
Definitely, and that's incredibly important. And we're heavily, because obviously this is just so pivotal to handling a lifetime of stress. To be able to sort of, if you can learn how to learn to manage each of those, just 10% better. That compounds so much over time. And I do think for us, like we're building our technology to sort of be foundational in terms of being able to tailor things. And I think we want to lean on other experts too to answer that question, which is like, if you had the capabilities of a wearable that's responding to physiology in real time with research grade data feeds and a software device that could deliver demands in real time, what would you do to help the people because I do think we want to partner with those people, and we want to use our technology platform to be able to tailor it, because it's enormous. And that's something that I do think in general a lot of the tools that we do develop at the baseball side, aside from the ones that are showing on-field things, a lot of them are just working on your basic regulatory capacity around your stress response. And I think a lot of that could be taken into some of these use cases you mentioned. I think we'd also be open to either collaborating in other avenues with experts to really help guide our technology in that direction as well.
Yeah, I think this kind of came out of that deep collaboration in athletics and the athletes coming to us and saying, this is something that I am dealing with. Is there any way you guys could create technology to help me in this space? But as Brian laid out, everyone has their on-deck circle, right? No matter what their lifestyle is, they know the feeling of something has disturbed or is about to disturb my kind of cruising state, and how do I build up capacity to be able to not get swayed heavily off, and if I do, what are my tools to be able to get back to where I need to be?
Does the assessment, and this goes back to one of Julie's questions, because people have stigma about their brain, and so you're coming in with this device to say, will you be good or not? What sort of pushback do you get from a device that says, this is how I handle stress and it matters for baseball?
But I think the key is that the intervention side of things, right? The other side of the card, right? Is to say we need to understand where you are today to then individualize an entire training regimen around what you're doing. So this is true on the visual motor integration side of things, all of the software and the VR and everything that we're doing in terms of trying to refine those, but it's also just as true on the autonomic, right? It's wherever you are to start today, you can improve, and now let's create and generate technology to help you get there.
So we have time for one more live question, and we're going to wrap up. So thank you, real quick.
Loving the presentation. One of my biggest things is when it comes to focus.
One of the biggest things I think about is, when it comes to focus, right? So you have some players, like let's say Michael Jordan, right, who thrived off trash talking. And you have others that, as soon as they get distracted by somebody or someone in the crowd, their game goes downhill. So, was that something into you, when you were doing your research and everything, and how can we improve on that?
And I think that this definitely fits into this kind of living under a microscope. We would talk to some players where they were talking about their World Series experience, and they said, whether they were on the mound or on deck, they said they could hear the peanut guy in the out. They were like, oh my gosh, usually it's just noise, right? I'm just able to kind of filter it out, and I could hear every single bad thing and good thing, but not much good stuff in the stadium. And they were like, it was like a microphone was on that ability. And whereas other players were able to say, I know that feeling, but with experience and with some tools in their tool belt, they knew they might be there, and then they were able to ramp themselves down to then have it be the noise, quote unquote. So I think it's that's a great example of the way that a player would talk about it. And we were kind of, as nerdy neuroscientists, saying, okay, I think this is what's maybe happening. Let's start discovering down that path.
Yeah, definitely. The focus is huge, because even with the physiological arousal, basically your stress response becomes an area of focus. It's pulling your attention. Like you said, the problem is it's pulling your attention away from the task at hand. And that's the same thing that happens with some of these on-field things. So all these different aspects are trying to set the stage where your attention is as close to 100% focused on allowing your elite visual motor expertise to handle incredible tough demands, and not these things or your body revving up and things like that. But focus is really central, as you said. Yeah.
So wow, like I said, brain health can be cool. What a great example of translating research and science into something practical. And that's what the Brain Performance Institute was built to do, was take for the Center for Brain Health and make these things real to improve lives, right? We say better brain, better life, better world. I think it's real. This is just a first step, right? So listen, thank you to the audience for coming tonight. You see the application, right? Mia Hamm was a soccer player. She hated to take PKs. Is that physical, or is that your brain? Ernie Els got the yips as a putter. Is that physical, or is that your brain? Everything begins and ends with your brain. We can't do what we do without your help. Thank you to KERA. Thank you to Spur Sports and Entertainment. And especially thanks to Brian and Wes and Dr. Fratantoni for helping us tonight. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.